significant other and beloved Ann Prebis, she and I went to see all that stuff. And when we go to San Francisco, we'd usually stay in San Jose.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like we'd talk about what we had just seen on the way home, on the way back to the motel, and then I'd write my review. So she was very involved in that. But, it's like, and, a big part of that. So, I mean, I've done a lot of stuff other than just painting, too.
Oh, yeah.
And that stuff's all on my website, too.
Right.
Along with most of my journal. So.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally awesome. Yeah. It was, when we first met, you and I and Ann first got together, I guess in summer of '99, somewhere in there, and...
So that's because it was after Skip died.
It was after Skip died.
Yeah.
And so it was, a few months after that, and I know you would come back and forth and we would visit whenever you were between Santa Barbara and San Francisco when you were checking out the operas and stuff.
Yeah.
And that was pretty cool. That was really neat.
Yeah.
A lot of good memories.
Actually, I was hanging out with Little Richard at the time, and Skip was getting ready to do a recording session at Pacific Studio in San Mateo, and I happened to mention it to Richard. And Richard says, "Oh, I know Skip Spence." And I said, "You do?" And he says, "Yeah." And I told him that, well, Skip's going to be doing a recording session at this studio in San Mateo, and I'm going up to the Bay Area for that. And Richard said, "Can you give me the phone number?" So I did. And that night, we're in the studio, and I had never known any of this before. Skip had never told me any of it.
Wow.
But we're in the studio, and about 1 or 2 in the morning, the phone rings. David Rubinson was the producer of the tape. The tape was Space Song and All My Life, which are, All My Life is one that Skip has written, and it's been recorded and released in various forms, but never this version that I have from the original studio version.
Yeah.
And I just sent that master tape of All My Life and Space Song to Skip's publisher, Lynn Quinlan. I just sent that. It's supposed to get there Monday. So, I'm not going to be around much longer, so I wanted that preserved, and that's where I generally go to preserve Skip stuff. So anyhow, we're in the studio. It's about 1 or 2 o'clock, and Skip's just going wild in the studio. If you've never been in a studio with him, a big studio where he's got a lot of room to work, move around, and stuff like that, it's impressive. And he's playing his guitar, and everybody else is playing, and he's arranging and organizing and conducting everybody, and just pretty much running the session. And he goes over and he's playing on the keyboards, and all of a sudden the phone rings. David Rubinson, the producer, picks up the phone, and I'm in the booth with David, and David picks up the phone, and he says, "Who?" And then there's a pause, and he says, "Who are you?" And then there's another pause, and he says, "Does Skip know you?" And all of a sudden, "Oh, hey Skip, Little Richard's on the phone and he wants to talk to you." Skip steps away from the keyboard, and he just yells to nobody in particular, everybody in general, "The king of rock and roll's on the phone and he wants to talk to me."
Yeah.
So Skip and Richard have a conversation, which I don't know what it was. But the next time I saw Richard, he started talking to me about it, and he was telling me. He says, "Yeah, I called Skip, and, well, I called Skip, and the guy on the phone who answered the phone, I said, he says, 'Who is this?' I said, 'Richard Penniman.' And he didn't know who I was."
Oh, that's incredible.
So finally I says, "Little Richard," and he figured it out then. And it turns out that Skip told me, I said, did you know Little Richard? And Skip says, "Oh yeah." He says, when Richard retired back in 1957 from rock and roll to become a minister, I called him up and said, "Little Richard, you can't retire from rock and roll. You got to stay in rock and roll. We need you out there. And Little Richard says, Skip, I've got other things I have to do. You know, the Lord is calling me, and I need to do that. And he formed Little Richard's traveling ministry show or something like that, and moved it all to L.A. And it was funny because there's a story about that. There's a great film of Little Richard's life on there, and it stops about 1963.
Yeah.
But Richard is the executive producer on it, and he talks about when he retired, and it's like he took like $1,000 ring, and $1,000 in 1957 was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And he threw it in the ocean. And so the people with him say, "What are you going to do that for? What are you doing that for?" And he says, "Well, if it doesn't cost anything, it's not really worth much. And you know, your conversion isn't really worth anything unless it costs you something." So he threw that ring in the ocean, and then he was supposed to take a plane back to the United States, and he postponed that plane ride, and the plane crashed, and everybody was killed.
Ooh, so he missed being killed by like a hair.
Yeah.
Wow.
And you know, he attributed it to the fact that he, you know, had that conversion. So he came back and he quit rock and roll, and at the peak of his fame, and had a Christian ministry. And then he picked up rock and roll later. He got back into rock and roll in 1963. Went to Germany and played some gigs there, and he had a little-known band that was opening for him called the Beatles. And taught Paul McCartney how to do the whoo and all of that, and you know, the Beatles made it pretty big after Richard left them.
Wow.
Or after they left Richard, but and Skip, I guess, had called him, and you know, it was, you know, Skip was a pretty spiritual guy.
Yeah,
and
he was.
That probably had a lot to do with it. You know, we talked about a little bit about that, but Skip didn't talk a lot about that. You had to, you know, press him to talk about that. But I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
And then Skip, you know, after that, Skip had called him back in 1957, and Richard returned the call in 1971. You know.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cycle of events.
Yeah. And I had never known any of that. You know, Richard's the one who told me his end of that conversation, and that he had known Skip back, you know, a long time ago. And Skip had never told me any of that until I asked him and pressed him about it.
Yeah, that's interesting bit of history there.
Yeah, it is.
It really is, yeah. So the band that Skip had at that time, the Yankees, as you informed me, because I learned all that from you originally.
Yeah, well, that was kind of fluid. You know, the name of the band was kind of fluid. Actually, the membership was kind of fluid, too.
Yeah. You know,
It was a really good band, though.
Yeah.
And one of the things Skip had told me was that after he arranged the first Grape album, which was the real classic, and I know a lot of the members of the Grape would dispute that, but Skip told me that, and his mother told me that, and everybody who was around there associated with Skip told me that. So, and that's what I believe. And I mean, you look at the sound of the first Grape album, and you look at everything else they did after that, and it was all completely different.
Well, you know, I don't think they would dispute that necessarily, because I've heard from the horse's mouth at least a couple of times that I remember both Peter Lewis and Jerry Miller saying that Skip was the guy. Skip
was the only one that was ready to go in the studio.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I thought Peter would dispute it. I didn't know.
He said he learned a lot from Skip, actually.
I did. Okay.
Yeah.
I've only spoken to Peter once for about 3 hours on the phone, and then I saw him play the next day. And it's hard to ignore somebody in a room full of 15 people. But Peter did just a wonderful job of ignoring me in that room. So I mean, I said something he really took exception to. I don't know what it was, but it probably had to do with Skip.
Yeah.
And and I know when Skip had his mental breakdowns, I know even back in the 70s, Peter was helping him out then.
Oh, yeah.
So I know Peter has done a lot for Skip.
Yeah.
And Skip has mentioned that. Also, Peter had a house in the Santa Ynez Valley, and the drummer for Buffalo Springfield, Dewey Martin, was another one of those guys who just kind of got cast by the wayside, and Peter was helping out Dewey, I know,
Yeah.
at some point. So, yeah, I mean, Peter, and, you know, so I know Peter has been doing that, and he did it all of Skip's life from the 70s on.
Yeah, he did. I used to, when I was hanging out and working with Skip on some material back in the 90s, let's say from late 95 on up to the end of 98, before Skip passed on a few months after that.
Yeah.
Peter came by and visited regularly, and sometimes all three of us were jamming together a little bit, you know,
Yeah.
right in the kitchen of the house that Skip was staying in. You know?
Yeah.
So that was kind of cool.
The only time I ever met Peter was after I had that 3-hour phone conversation with him. I went to see him at a place called the Coffee Gallery Backstage in Altadena. It's a little venue of about 20 people.
Yeah.
And it was, you know, just Peter and his guitar. And that's the only time I ever met the guy.
Okay.
And as I say, we didn't have much of a conversation.
Yeah.
But, you know, and...
But, you know, getting back to the Yankees, I just thought I would interject this real quick. In November 2002, yeah, it was November 2002, Bob Dylan played at the Greek Theater in Berkeley. I tried to get in there, but, you know, I blew it because I didn't get a ticket in advance. So I thought, well, you know, it's probably not going to sell out, even though he's going to pack the place. You know, big mistake. But it was I think it was intended to happen, though, because when I went out there, I realized, wow, there's no way I'm going to get a ticket. There's
You
no
met
way.
Bruce Ginsberg.
I met Bruce Ginsberg. I went back to the area in back of the theater, past where the little parking lots were, and past, you know, where there's a little hill up there that's got a wooden stairway going all the way up it. And I was hanging out there, and he showed up, and we were talking the whole time during the show. We'd occasionally listen to a song, you know, we could hear it back there even though we couldn't see it.
Yeah.
And I found out, we got on the subject of music, and one thing led to another, and then he mentioned a guy named Rick Townsend, and I just turned around and said, oh, are you talking about the Rick Townsend? The guy that played guitar in a band called the Yankees? And it was just like, he lit up, and I realized, you know, then he told me, yeah, I was a drummer for the Yankees.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, wow, so we both knew Skip then.
Yeah.
You know, that was like one of those things that, you know, what are the odds of it ever happening? And it just seemed like there was some kind of synchronicity at work just for that whole episode right there.
Oh, I'm sure there was.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's funny because Skip and I used to talk a lot about, you know, Moby Grape and stuff like that. And he said after the first album, Skip never did anything that wasn't a joke. He never did a serious song again with Moby Grape after that. And the last time I saw Skip was about 1974, so this is the frame of reference I'm talking about. But all he did was joke songs, and I asked him, what about...
Seeing.
I says, I know a lot of that stuff. Yeah, I asked him about, what about Seeing? And he says, that was just an old track that they stuck on, that they wanted to put on Grape 69. That was something we had done a long time ago. So that didn't count in Skip's mind. And because he wasn't the one that put it on the recording, and it wasn't any sort of new recording. It was just something that was involved.
I get it.
And I asked him about, what about Chinese Song? And he says, Paul, Chinese Song it's named Chinese Song, and it's played on a Japanese instrument. I know the difference.
Yeah, right. I've always wondered about that.
Yeah.
But it's a great song.
Oh, it is. I mean, a lot of those, Funky Tonk was a great song, but I mean, it was a joke.
Yeah.
And there's no other way you can look at it. So I thought that was real interesting, and especially in considering the fact that when he did Chinese Song on 20 Granite Creek, he also had All My Life in his pocket, and he had Space Song in his pocket, and another song called Sailing Ships. And
Oh yeah.
Skip, I mean, it's funny because after we did that recording session, we went to there's a Lions restaurant across the street, and Skip wanted more ketchup for his hamburger. He didn't have enough ketchup. So he made up a song. I want more ketchup. And when the waitress came, he sang her this song that he had just made up 10 minutes before.
Right.
And I mean, it was amazing. And then the band, we went down and played, got them some gigs in Santa Barbara. And we went down and played in Santa Barbara, and they performed this song. I need more ketchup.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So yeah, he had a comedian side to him.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's just like, Skip, they say Mozart would leave a party and come back an hour later with a piano concerto. Skip was a lot like that too.
Okay.
I mean, even when he was, when he was young like that until, he had his big breakdown. But he even had a few of those after his breakdown. But Skip, I mean, the guy was just amazing like that. And he always had new songs, and instead of asking you a question, he would write a song about it,
It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, he had, great songs. He just wouldn't play them with a grape.
I see. Yeah, I see. Or else, yeah.
And that's pretty much what got me into paintings. I just didn't want to have to deal with any of that stuff. My art was my escape and, my peace of mind and stuff like that, and I just didn't want to have to deal with that. That's where I let out all of my violence, and everything else was into my art, and I didn't want to have to break guitars and, things like that.
Yeah, any kind of artistic expression is an incredibly good outlet.
Yeah, it is.
Because I became a musician, but when I was a kid, I was into the visual arts too.
Well, still, it's like, the great musicians really bang on their instruments too. I mean, It's not like treat this gently, when you're playing it.
Yeah.
When you're not playing it, and don't let anybody else touch it. With a lot of people, and Skip, to his credit, always let me play anything I wanted to play of his. Including his guitar that Gordon Stevens made for him that was covered in cowhide and had foot and a half bull horns curling up around the neck.
Also, Gordon Stevens made that for him. Huh?
Yeah, I know.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard stories about that instrument.
I saw him play it on stage once when he was playing with Dr. John the Night Tripper. He was just a sideman that John hired when he played the Fillmore. And I look up on stage and there's Skip with a gold suit and that guitar with the bull horns curling up around the neck. I didn't even know he was going to be playing that night.
So you were there.
Oh yeah.
I'd only heard about it, through reading an article about him. Might have been the one that Johnny Angel did back in 1994. But yeah, I'd read about him.
Oh, I swear to God, Dr. John was like, the show he put on was just spectacular. But it could have been God up there itself. You would still have to look at Skip.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt.
So.
Amazing stuff.
Yeah, why don't we wrap this up and get up the mountain?
Yeah, well, that was good.
Okay.
Excellent.
Yeah,
right
it was.
Okay.